going to start this off with a little bit of trivia. And all you experienced saw mechanics out there are going to look at each one of these and identify them. Know exactly what they're from. I want you to look at the stroke, bearing size. I'm not going to measure it, but I'm going to tell you that motor right there has the longest stroke. It's got the biggest piston because that's from a 372. And that's what comes with them. 6202 bearing. This one here is from a 562, so diameter-wise it's got the same size bearing as a 372. It just has a different seal arrangement. Instead of having the seals in the cases, they're integral to the bearing, right? Radial seal sits out there. Small bearings, short stroke. What the heck is this? Number one, instead of having this size bearing like a 562 and a 372 have, got this size bearing like a 572, 385, 390, even 660s. You all guess what this is yet? This is from a steel 310. Don't read too much in this, but you just got to see this. Those damn things are never going to fail. If they fail, it's not because of vibration or mechanical failure. It'd be from oil or wear or just being old. That is one rugged little design right there, that crankshaft. To review, for just a short review, I just don't have the time to write a book on camera. But the way Autotune works is you have these three different modes, and this is actually pretty important. You have start, you have low throttle or idle, and you have full throttle operations when it gets past a certain percentage point. Because on the carburetor there's a throttle position sensor, right? Throttle position sensor plays into what fuel mapping gets used. With the Autotune, you have both the manual choke plus the Autotune itself playing a game there with the fuel, trying to add fuel. So when you first start it, you're getting more fuel because of choking, but you're also getting a different fuel map because of Autotune. This saw here, I have not started today. It literally has not been started in at least 2 years. So I'm going to pump it up because the procedure is use the primer bulb to get fuel all the way through into the carburetor. I just filled it up with gas, and that primer is really kind of sluggish. It's a little bit cold, a little bit stiff. So anyway, make sure that the whole system is primed. Oh, and before I get there, so you have the start condition, low throttle, and full throttle. At full throttle, what happens with these Autotune systems, I don't think I've ever explained it because I've always assumed that Husqvarna would put a video out and explain it for people. So I'm going to give you a synopsis of what's going on. And this may disturb you. But what goes on is this, is your full throttle, that thing's spinning 10,000 RPM somewhere up there while you're trying to cut wood. What Autotune will do is there's a little solenoid that opens and closes, and kind of flutters at a fairly high rate of speed doing that. And that's how it meters the fuel. If when it opens and closes, it stays open for a longer period of time before it closes again, that means it lets more fuel into the system. Conversely, on that same cycle, if it stays closed for a longer period of time, it means it's getting less fuel. So what'll happen is this thing is kicking along, and the Autotune will hold that little solenoid closed for a couple of revolutions, right? Now what'll happen is that's going to lean the mixture out just a little bit. If the RPMs pick up on the saw and it's detected by Autotune, that means it needs a little less fuel because it's running a little bit too rich. If, on the other hand, the RPMs drop off, that means it doesn't have enough fuel. So it'll add a little more fuel in the next set of cycles before the next test. So it keeps doing that. It'll hold it closed, it'll lean it out, it'll detect whether the RPMs are going up or down in that, say, 5 or 6 RPM test. and then it'll adjust slightly the mixture of the carburetor for the next period of time, and then it does another test. Closes off the fuel, watches the RPMs, it either goes up or down, and then based on what it sees, it'll either add more fuel or take fuel away, and then continue on for the next series. Now it's just continually doing that, always doing that lean test, always adjusting the mixture to try to get more RPMs out of the saw. That's what it's shooting for, max RPMs. And that's why Autotune will tune around other issues. So it's testing. Let's say a leaf comes in and slaps onto that air filter. It does the lean out test because now the air has been cut off. And as soon as it leans out, it starts picking up RPMs because it needs less fuel because of that choked off air filter. Well, the carburetor will start adjusting by holding the valve closed longer while it's doing its little flutter routine, letting fuel through in order to lean the mixture out, and then does another test. It'll do it again, it'll do another test, it'll do it again. Next thing you know, it's leaned the carburetor down to a point to where it actually runs with that darn leaf sitting on top of the air filter. That's what's going on. I don't know if that makes any sense. Let's see if this darn thing will even start. It's been sitting for a long time. So after you've got this thing primed, is you take that control deal, you pull it out, push it up, and that turns the choke on and it turns on the high idle. Wow. So in 2 pulls I got to pop. Turn that choke off. Autotunes. I'm not going to get into the detail. That's really for your Husqvarna dealers to do. But basically what you have is you have a system here where you have an ignition system, a little chip, some smarts, along with a temperature sensor, a throttle position sensor, and this little solenoid operated valve which kind of flutters back and forth, opening and closing the fuel supply to the carburetor. And they all work in concert to make the Autotunes run well the way they do. Based on throttle position, there's a couple of situations that chip is designed to deal with. Idling, and the one that's important to me is not idle. Well, I guess it is at some level, but the one at full throttle. And what happens when the saw is perceived to be under load is that system is always trying to tune the saw for maximum performance. And what it does this little lean test, and it does it very frequently, and it takes a very short period of time, and based on what happens with that test, it either decides to add fuel or take it away in order to maximize the RPMs in that particular situation. The takeaway though, as well as testing and tuning and testing and tuning, it never stops when you're working that saw. It leaves a bit of a history on the chip, and when you go into Common Service Tool and plug in, you can read that history. And based on what you see there, you can get a sense as to what's happened to that saw. This is looking at our hill from the hill across the valley. It's snowing so much you almost can't see our hill from here. Okay. Well, I took down the last video, you probably noticed, and the reason was that when I started the video, I put on a little bit of a section where I was doing a sort of a focused tune to sort of set the carburetor to where I needed it to be on that given day. And when I had the text on the screen, I said part throttle. Well, that's not necessarily true, because part throttle means anything from just off idle to full throttle, right? Really what you have to do is get that throttle position sensor to where it's in the mode where the auto tune is iterating to try to tune the saw. Otherwise you're kind of wasting your time. And suffice to say that it's going to be more than half throttle, and what I'm going to say is somewhere around 75-80% throttle to full throttle, and then you have to give it enough load when you do that not to over rev it. So you want to keep the RPMs in the 8,000 to 12,000 RPM range, and you want close to full throttle. And then on the generation of auto tune of my 2014 562, it takes about 30 seconds, and you can hear it. It'll just settle right out. Now what's happened is you're just basically giving the saw a long enough cut to tune itself to whatever the weather conditions and other situations that might be tuning around. And then it runs great. It'll continue to tune itself from that point on. Sometimes it's hard to get them started. You might have to give them a little bit more choke or add a little choke from time to time in order to get them fired up if it's really, really cold. Well, that's why you have a choke. Then once it gets started, let it warm up. Don't cold seize a thing. I see these guys, and they'll just jump right to the log and bury it for a few seconds and say, hey, it's tuned. Well, again, the theory is if you get the throttle position sensor open far enough to where it gets into its iteration of tuning, that's correct. And the newer ones, they tune a little faster than the older ones, so it doesn't take long. And I think, after I was thinking about what I did say and what I didn't say, there were a few clarifications I needed to put into the mix. So this is what this video is about. Some of the same as before, and some new stuff. Because one of the comments was a couple of guys saying, geez, tell us more about Autotune. We use it, we don't use it much, and it could be of some benefit. So I'm going to try to cover a few things here. First and foremost, this is not a bootleg copy. It's not off of eBay. Please don't insult me by asking me to go outside the bounds. I do this through a dealer. Basically, I don't have access to Common Service Tool outside the bounds of a dealership. But I think Common Service Tool is one of the better tools a dealer has, but also a reason for a customer to go visit the dealer. So rather than try to come up with reasons to take it out of the dealer network, I would rather see Husqvarna and their dealers figure out how to leverage Common Service Tool to attract people back in and start that dialogue. That's a whole other discussion. It's where my heart is. I'm not going to say any more about it, but no, you're not going to go find one of these on eBay and set it up. Second, like I had pointed out in the last video, I am not online. This is a standalone system. And the reason why I brought it up in the last video was because somebody had said that, oh gee, Steel can take their tools out and reset saws in the field. Well, this is case in point that Husqvarna and their dealerships can as well. Because basically what's happened here is this is an older setup, and the firmware is not up to date, probably a couple of months out of whack, but it's a standalone system where I can pick it up and carry it out to a bunch of saws and do some basic analysis like I'm going to show you right here without any internet connection, any internet access. It's just a simple standalone system that plugs into the Common Service Tool port on the saw. The way that would operate if you're a dealer, I'm talking to you as if you're a dealer now, is if you've got Common Service Tool and you have a service truck and you want to go out and help some of your customers that have, a lot of saws in a particular area, it's something you can bring as a value add, taking this to them versus expecting them to come to you all the time. And you don't have to be tied to the network to do this. Basically, when you're at your dealership, you log on to your system, log on to the Husqvarna site, download whatever the greatest versions or whatever the latest versions they have for firmware, and then go offline and take this system out into the field and service your customers. That's the concept. So yes, the Husqvarna dealers do have the ability of taking a laptop with Common Service Tool and going out into the field and doing the kind of things I'm going to do here. Because that's what we're doing. We're standalone. I'm not hooked up to any network. I don't have access to the Husqvarna site. I can't log on and get it anyway. Understand whatever I can do here that your dealer has the same capability. And you armed with a little bit of information about the kind of things that they have. A discussion can be had, And you guys can use Common Service Tool to either debug or track or predict a potential issue. So let's get into it. Now that I've gone through that, I'm just going to deal with carburetors up to EL48s for now. The saw on the back of the bench has got the new one. This carburetor came from one of the early versions of the 562. It is a EL44B, okay? Nothing wrong with the carburetor, it works just fine. Its disadvantage, from my perspective, was the fact that you had to plug into this port right here, which is really hard to get to in order to plug in the Common Service Tool. The next set of carburetors that came on the 562s were these. These are EL46s. And the big change, they had some other things, but the big change was instead of just having this port right here, they also added this, which made it a whole lot easier to detach that and plug into Common Service Tool. And then over a period of time, they came up with these, which was an EL48. Let me see if I can turn it around to where you can see right in there. EL48 is what this one is. I got this one tied to an ignition. But regardless of which version of the carburetor it is, even though it was a 44, 46, or 48, you still get the same kind of reporting and the same kind of tools with Common Service Tool, even on the oldest of these carburetors, which is the point. The new carburetors are even better. They're better yet. We'll get into those because we're going to do an upgrade, I don't know, in a couple of weeks possibly. I've got a new carburetor that goes on to a customer's 562 and I have to flash it. I want to focus on the kind of things that you get and the kind of analysis you can make just simply with this report right here, the operating history. Let's start with the error codes, because usually what happens is the person has a problem and they're going to go right to the error codes to try to figure out what's going on. Let me see if I can zoom in on that. And in this case here, it's saying it had an error code 17 one time. The first time was 75 starts ago, and the last time was 75 starts ago. Okay? Now, when it comes to these, there are going to be situations where the saw will throw an error code. It's running on its side, a fuel line begins to fail, things like that, where it might be running lean, start throwing codes. It doesn't mean that there's these big internal issues. Maybe it got tossed on its side or upside down and finally stalled, but it ran long enough to throw an error code. But then when you turn it right side up and fire it up, the saw is fine, and then that error code doesn't get thrown again. Well, all this is, it just collects all that data from the time that you've reset this carburetor to when you download this information. That entire period of time, it's collecting information, it's collecting data, and one of the things it's collecting obviously is the error codes. This one only had one, 75 starts ago. Whatever that was, doesn't matter now because it's not happening now. It only happened once. I'm not worried about it. You know, just don't worry about it. It's not important. Let's find out what a 17 is anyway. So I'll go to Documents, Error Codes, sort of a manual that kind of comes along with the package. And it said error code 17. So one time that particular saw that had that carburetor had low idle speed or minimum fuel level for idling. You know, seized piston, all this kind of crap. No, that wasn't happening. It didn't happen. It happened once. So all this stuff is like the purveyors of gloom and doom don't matter because it happened one time, whatever threw that code, and it hasn't happened since. And there's been a fair number of starts between the time it did happen. Not an issue. Does that make any sense? All right, so let's look at the operating history of this one. Check this one out. This is cool. It only ran for, look up here first, it only ran for 29 hours. It has 456 starts. And check out these numbers right here. 68, 88, 70, 105. That 105, I don't like that. Something happened to that saw, okay? But currently it's at 88, and that's okay. And the current low is at 68, that's good. The minimum high was 70, that's where probably it started. That default, I believe, is 70 or 75, so that's okay. It's only gone up to 88, so it's leaned out some, but somewhere in its life it hit 105, which is that's too lean. I don't like that. If you look at the way it's been run, see this right here? It's only been run hard 12% of its time. Most of the time it just sits down here and idles. See down here? But you see up here it got to the 14,000 RPMs that I was talking about before. That's cool. Let's see what it has for error codes, if any. It's got 113. Oh, look at that. It did it one time 8 starts ago. Now, a 13, I can tell you right now, that's a lean condition. That's right here. If you look right there, it's got the 13, 8 starts ago. Now you pay attention a little bit to the these numbers. But it's only 88 now. So 8 starts ago, maybe it ran out of gas. You know what I'm saying? But I'm going to look. And even though the current high isn't way out of range, I see an error code that happened just 8 starts ago where it was a 13. The documentation on what a 13 is, lean come down, the engine speed decreases slowly when the throttle is released. That kind of thing happens with an air leak. Throttle valve is not completely closed when idle, so now you're going to check the carburetor to make sure it actually opens and closes the throttle. And that could be from a sticky throttle cable. Incorrect cutting equipment used. No, doesn't work. Air leak. Fuel with 25% more alcohol. That's possible. So again, nothing in there says that it's going to be catastrophic, right? But I got a 13, 8 starts ago. That is a lean type of a code. It says lean come down, so it said air leak type of thing. Maybe I do a brake clean test on that saw based on what I see on the manual. And that's the kind of thing that you have to be intuitive about. But the general history of the saw, it has not been run hard. You can see that right here. It only has one error code one time, even though it was recent. That 105 right there is why I'm nervous. I do a compression test just because I do it all the time. The fact it's got the 14,000, it's getting the full RPM, so it probably has compression. You know what I'm saying? It's probably okay, but I'd do it anyway. Maybe leak down test. What I just do is a brake clean test. And if the saw is running good, nothing there. Nothing there to scare you. Let's go to another carburetor. Oh, I've already reset this one. Darn it. Oh, this is the carb that I had in my last video. I've already reset the history of use. I know the history of this saw. And this is actually interesting because notice right here, it only got to 12,752 RPMs. Combined with the current high is 105. I don't like 105. That's a too much number. And the low is 97. So not only was it running lean, but it also wasn't getting to RPM. What happens in a scenario like this, if we look at the error codes, we're going to see a whole bunch of lean related things. 14s and 17s. 14s, let's take a look. But before I even get into the documentation, let's assume that I've done a compression test, all right? And let's assume that I've also done a brake clean test. I'm going to tell you that I know the history of this saw, and I'm going to tell you that there are some clues right in these numbers right here as to what happened in those tests. So I don't know if I should tell you the results or go through the story. So we got this saw in, it's got a whole pile of error codes, and it happened multiple times, the 17, multiple times. And the last time it did it was 59 starts ago. This number right here is a little misleading, I guess. If an error code happens frequently, and it's happened within, say, 70 starts, this one's 59, so it's within 70, pay attention, because the fact that it's happening frequently, it's been doing it for a fairly long time based on the number of starts ago it started, and it just did it again fairly recently. That means whatever that is an ongoing issue with that saw. That's when you start paying attention to the mechanics of the saw. There's a big flag. That combined with these numbers tell you that there is a problem. Now again, assume common service tool doesn't have this big flag, but it gives you clues. You combine common service tool with a compression test, with my brake clean test, and combine with all those three things, you can get pretty close to what's going on with that saw over the period of time that this was picking up data. Otherwise, this saw started a cycle that was stored in this little chip on the carburetor 383 hours ago. It's been run for a period of time. And over that period of time, somewhere 3 thousand, that's an arbitrary number, starts ago, it started having these 17s. And it continued having that issue until pretty recently. It ends up in his shop. It's probably not running good. It's not getting the full RPMs, 12,752. So obviously it can't get there. It's been leaning these things out. Now a mechanic is going to look at that and go, what? You lost compression, buddy. You know, and the carburetor is going to try to lean, they try to get that now 6 saw up to its top RPMs. It wants to get to 13, 14,000, but it can't. And it keeps trying to iterate with its lean out test. Based on what it sees, it makes an adjustment, does another lean out test, and it's trying to make that 6 saw run. And in doing so, that lean out test keeps telling it to get to max RPM through leaning out the saw. So these numbers keep creeping up. That little solenoid stays closed for even longer periods of time. It adjusts auto-tune in order to lean that carburetor out with that lean out test, and to try to keep the RPMs up in that saw so it's making power. And it starts running out of adjustment, basically. So let's look what the 17 is and what the 14 is to see whether or not that supports our premise that we probably lost compression somewhere. A 14, carburetor attempts to provide more fuel than is possible at high speed. Pay attention to that. Think about, don't forget 14. On the one hand, a 14 is saying, wait a minute, we can't give enough fuel because something's wrong, I can't give it enough fuel. What's the 17? 17 is something different. Low idle speed, minimum fuel for idling, the product may have bad acceleration or other lean. Auto-tune has reached the maximum lean setting. And then it goes into seized piston, all that kind of stuff. Well, how can those two exist? How can a 14 where it's trying to go rich and can't get enough fuel, and then 17, well, now it's lean? How can those two possibly exist, right? Well, we got to remember that what you're looking at is you're looking at a sampling over a period of time. You're looking at a sampling over 383 hours. And at some point, it threw a 14, at some point it started throwing 17s. Well, when you see the min high at 32, all right, that's when something let go. You got an air leak. It's just dumping fuel to try to keep it to run. Oh, I want you to hear something. That's that little solenoid operated fuel valve going through its normal cycle. Now when you look at those numbers, you hearing that thing click? Let's listen to it for a second. Let's abort the test. There's a period of time it opens and closes, opens and closes, opens and closes. And if it stays open for a longer period of time than it stays closed, the numbers go low because it's measuring how long that little valve stays closed. That's what this number is. So otherwise, the bigger the number, the longer it's closed. The smaller the number, the less time the valve is closed, therefore the longer time that it's open. Does that make any sense? It tells a story, absolutely does not replace being a good mechanic. It just doesn't. The error codes, along with this basic information here, combined with being a mechanic, possibly the documentation, are just tools that the dealer has to help you maintain your saw. Now, let me just explore that for a second. If that came in, guys complaining about a saw, it goes right to service for a compression test, right? And it'll save you a whole lot of hassle because you'll know pretty quickly, and so will they, what's going on with that saw. Because as soon as you see those numbers, you do a compression test, you realize the top end is whooped. The guy can tell you, well, you know, I have to do at least the top end. Now he sees that number right there, that min high down in the 32 range, which means it dumped fuel for a period of time. Not only will he need to do a top end probably based on what we're seeing here, and I suspect this compression, and it did, compression test will confirm that, but we better look for some major leaks in that saw. Now right now it has 383 hours, but you see how you can reset history, reset this, you can reset these independently, so you might not get rid of the accumulated hours and delete this. So I can't really tell you that this is a collection over the last 383 hours. I mean, it could be, but It might not be. If this was a saw that I was supporting from new, I'm not going to get into it right now, but there's a nice little notebook feature you have on Common Service Tool where I can keep track of those things. And then if so I make a change, maybe I leave that alone and just reset the fuel settings, and the next time it comes in, I'll have a new set of numbers here that I can track against the old ones. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, theoretically this could be the numbers tracked over that 383 hours, but likely not. Likely it had been into the dealer, likely it had been serviced, likely those numbers have been reset. Hoping this is going to give you some idea of what's available. And again, it's collecting pecker tracks. It's collecting data. It's not telling you the full story. It's just collecting information, and then you can build the full story combined with the other basic tests, like I said before, compression and leak down test or brake clean test, things like that. I guess the second message is you got to open your mind a little bit to recognize that this is telling a story over a period of time. And the min and the max and the average is telling you over a period of time. This information here, when it was displayed, this one here I deleted already, it shows you over a period of time. The error codes is over a period of time. So when you start looking at that information, looking at the error codes, looking at these numbers, you got to envision not just a two-dimensional plane in time where it's max high, that's what it is right now. You got to go three-dimensional in your mind and say, hey, this is information that's been collected over a period of time. My suggestion is a dealer getting into Common Service Tool is always plug it in, always get the information, and then always do your mechanical stuff. And I'm sure the Husqvarna service guys will, with all kinds of intuition, they've been looking at this stuff for years now. But what you do, you see what you saw on Common Service Tool, and then you see what you found mechanically. You fix the saw, and then go on to the next one. And after a while, you're going to start seeing the trends, like I've been seeing, with these numbers. Husky gives you kind of an idea with the error codes, but your experience with your customers at your altitude, with how they operate the saw, track them in the logbook section, and then you start also gaining experience, kind of like Autotune picking up information from the saw as it runs. Well, you as a mechanic, by doing this, observing what happened with the saw in conjunction with what you're seeing in here, you're starting to learn yourself that same iteration about, hey, you plug it in, you get these kind of numbers. Well, I'm probably going to go look at an air filter, or I'm going to probably look at a seized cylinder or something like that, because you've seen enough of these that you also see the trends. And it matches up with the documentation sometimes, sometimes not. Also, you look at that information, you can tell a customer, you better go change your air filter. It looks pretty dirty. Well, I just blew it out with a air hose. It looks pretty clean to me. Well, look at that right there, guy. You might want to think about changing your air filter. So it helps the dealer have a conversation with his customer about the things he might need to do in order to maintain his saw. The gas might be off, the air filter, maybe the way you're operating the saw, you got it wound out 90% of the time, or you got it idling 90% of the time. And it just helps give you information that you can then bring to the customer. I'm going to make a very subtle point, and some are going to get this and some aren't. One of the real subtle benefits of something like Common Service Tool is it's an inanimate object. It's not a person. So when you're sitting there talking to your customer, he's looking at that screen and you're looking at that screen. No one's disputing those numbers. It's not about being a jerk and giving me things I don't want to see. It's an inanimate object. So when the customer sees it right there and you interpret it, he's not going to get as upset as if he thinks you're trying to take him for a ride and he can't see what it is you're talking about. So having Common Service Tool as that focus of conversation can sometimes be very useful in a potentially tense situation as you're talking to your customer. Maybe it's a warranty that's not going to work. Maybe it's something he's doing that you've picked up that you can verify with Common Service Tool. Being the inanimate object that it is, he can't get mad at it. I mean, it's just raw data. It's a subtle tool. There's my spiel for the night. I think what I'm going to do is, if you guys are interested, I want to start up a Facebook or a MeWe page for Autotune users. And what I mean by that is the guys running the Common Service Tool and Autotune, so that we can share the experiences, maybe show the screens, and develop a dialogue. Hey, this is what I saw. What have you seen? And start sharing that experience. I wish Husqvarna would do this, but to me, it's just an exercise in being, I'm a hobbyist. I'm not a guy in the business. I don't really have a horse in a race, but I'm an old computer guy. I did the computer thing for a long time. I did the customer service. So having that kind of dialogue with other techs really helped me. So maybe having an independent place where we can all kind of discuss what we're seeing might be of interest. Number one, could be fun. People can brag about their successes, but also can start sharing experiences. Well, the task for the next couple of minutes here is just to take down those 2 trees right there and block them up. So I took down the one video because I have to make a couple of adjustments in that video. One was to clarify the cost of a 572 short block. The retail is like $225, which means the dealer cost is less. And in that segment I was talking to the dealers thinking about costing a job to repair the 372. And the other is on the reset in the field, because really what's happening is you just have to have that saw running close to full throttle for a period of time, and that gives it enough time to adjust itself.